there anything else in the Enlightenment that we should know? I know pluralism is one of the things, as we were talking about before, that, that how does the Enlightenment affect today? Pluralism is going to be one of them. Is there anything else in the Enlightenment that we should kind of hash through? You mentioned, elevation of reason, and then kind of looking down upon the traditions that have been inherited.
So if we were to talk to Enlightenment thinkers from 200 years ago, or people kind of in that thread or strain, small L liberal or classic liberal thinkers, even though they might not believe in all of the pluralism and all of the equality that kind of your modern Westerners typically believe in, they're definitely on that trajectory. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing that I want to point out. And then that last thing about someone who went to a society where let's use slavery as an example. Not only would they many times say this is intrinsically wrong, but almost blind to any circumstance, saying this needs to be remedied immediately. And it's hard. I bet that there's people that are very well-meaning Lutheran Christians
mm-hmm.
who cannot conceive of how slavery would be the best of the options in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
I've had to deal with this in Bible class many times because the Bible does not condemn slavery.
Mm-hmm.
C.F.W. Walther has a masterful essay on this. And the Bible really talks about how the slaves should be treated by their Christian masters and how the slaves should treat their masters, and vice versa. And yet we see in the Old Testament so many times where there is slavery instituted by God's people. Think about the Gibeonites, for
mm-hmm.
instance. Joshua conquers the land, or he's conquering the land, and this Canaanite delegation comes and tricks him into making a treaty, because they're in rags. He doesn't think they're Canaanites.
You got to have a lot of respect for that guy.
I know,
right?
I know.
That guy was on his P's and Q's.
Oh, absolutely. They were very clever. They wanted to survive.
Yeah.
And they actually get to be a part of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they don't have full rights. They don't get full civil rights. They don't even get full churchly rights. None of them can be priests
mm-hmm.
or Levites, but of course not all the Israelites could either. And yet, who was more blessed? The cities that were destroyed, like Jericho, or the Gibeonites? Now, you could say, yeah, well, if you compare that, but wouldn't it be better if the Israelites would have let them be free? I would say no. No, because we are not approaching the situation from pure rationality, and this is the thing I wanted to bring up, with an ideal that we're going to insist upon. Mm-hmm. But think about it. If you're an Israelite, if you're Joshua, here are these people who've been practicing despicable paganism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the most vile worship and
human sacrifice, brothels, rape. I mean, it's really atrocious when you look at it.
Yeah, it's absolutely abhorrent.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to give those people equal voting rights? I mean, you don't have those anyway, but are you going to give them full civil power or the same civil power and authority of your own people?
Mm-hmm.
That's insane.
Mm-hmm.
You would not do that.
You make me think, this is good. I've never actually thought about this, but it all comes down to what is your ideal? And the ideal in the Bible is to be able to worship God and to have your life somehow aligned towards like virtue and goodness, the things that God has created you for. That is more important than this kind of liberal freedom where it's like, well, we should let them do whatever they want, according to their own, because what they're doing is really bad, and it's bad for them, and it's bad for everyone around them, and it is kind of a cancer and a darkness. So the better thing is for them to be somehow brought into God's people and to be taught and in some ways forced to do things that are good for them. The same way you might force your 3-year-old to go do something that they don't want to do because it's actually good for them. That's the role that God has with people, not to just say, I want you guys to go do whatever you want now.
Yeah.
So what are you aiming towards?
Yeah, I mean, those Gibeonites were brought into the church by slavery,
mm-hmm.
And sometimes slavery is the best option. What are you going to do? Genocide them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard for us to think about, because not only do we have, like what you said, a different ideal kind of pushing in the back of our brain, but also that Americans especially, but broadly speaking, Westerners, they are so focused on the ideal that they think if we are not moving to that as fast as possible, then somehow this isn't virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
And they confuse that with, frankly, the gospel. I mean, that's why St. Paul says it doesn't matter whether you're a slave or free.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter at the end of the day. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, all things being equal, I'd rather not have people enslaving other people, and yet at the same time, sometimes it's the best of the options available.
Mm-hmm.
And St. Paul totally makes it clear, what actually should we be most concerned about? That's not to say that civil matters don't matter at all.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a slave in Corinth, stop obsessing about it.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an opportunity for freedom, as St. Paul says, if your master frees you, awesome, great. Now be a good free man. But you can be just as much a Christian as a slave, or as a woman, or as a Scythian, or as a Greek, or as a Jew. That's again, it doesn't mean those things don't matter, but they pale in comparison to actually living a faithful Christian life.
Let's say 3 quick things.
Yeah.
First off, I'm guessing at least a third of the audience right now is probably, whatever you want to call it, triggered, or whatnot.
Triggered,
They're probably,
yeah.
Because this is probably not a concept they've ever.
Yeah.
This has not probably been taught this way in Bible study or whatnot. But I do think that this is important what you're saying. So one, hear David Ramirez out. As we keep going about this, wrestle with this, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. Second, it is interesting as you're talking about this to bring back to what we talked about previously with Luther, saying the civil government should have some kind of civil punishment for abhorrent heresies and things like that. So Luther was even thinking of this way of there is a higher virtue than just letting people do whatever the heck they want.
Yeah.
Right. So that, it aligns with that. And then the third one, I always think it's helpful when you talk about slavery, people's minds immediately go to the slavery in the South.
Yeah.
Right. So they're immediately thinking of black slavery in the South.
Yeah.
And when you go back to there's different types of it all the way throughout history, right? So there's not like just one thing you can say. But slavery in many of these contexts are put into areas where these are agricultural nations, or shepherding type nations. There's not like 20 openings on Indeed for accounting positions or something like that. So a lot of these like ancient civilizations are such to where, the way that God structures it within the Israelite nation is, okay, you can become a slave, and you're a slave for, 6 years or so, and then they've got the opportunity to maybe buy some land or maybe do.
Well, no, that would be an Israelite,
who
allows
which is different from when they conquer a nation and bring it in.
That's different.
But still, slavery is multifaceted. So if your mind immediately goes to the narratives of slavery in the South, don't let your mind go immediately to that. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, I actually think that the Gibeonites are similar in some ways because. Yes, you are correct that there's a whole spectrum of slavery from chattel, generational slavery, all the way up to, you're a trusted head steward who's more of a servant than anything else. Yeah. And you've got different levels of serfdom in there and other things. You've got the redemptioners who can, buy their way out and things like that. So yeah, there is a big spectrum, but I don't want to soften the shock, frankly, in the sense that, yes, I know that Americans especially immediately go to, the southern United States and think about, oh, this was horrible and this was bad. And so, I don't want to say, well, this slavery was utterly different. I mean, the Gibeonites weren't. That was based on ethnicity, and so I don't want to lessen the discomfort too much. Yeah. Because, God did use slavery all across the ancient world and into the modern era to actually bring blessings to people. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't ever want to be a slave. I would hate it. And I think ultimately slavery winds up degrading not just the slave, but the master as well. My point is to say, and yet...
You'd rather be a slave than a pagan.
Yeah, absolutely.
A Christian slave than a pagan.
Absolutely. And actually, I was going to make a different point too. I think that we have to understand as not just Christians, but reasonable, historically minded people that sometimes it is the best option of the options before you. I'll give you an example I use in Bible study all the time. It's silly, but I think it works. Especially, in societies like you were talking about, very, very agrarian. You don't have money for prisons and things like that. So there's a tribe across the river, and there's a bitter feud. Now, of course, an Enlightenment influenced person will say, "Well, you just got to sort it out." Well, maybe you don't. It only takes one to fight.
Yeah.
And those people invade your land every stinking summer, or whenever, when it's time for kings to go out to war, they come in and you finally defeat them in a total victory. And what are you going to do with those people? Well, according to Israelite law from God through Moses, you're going to put to death who? The men of military age. But what are you going to do with those old men and the women and the children? Well, you really only have three options in front of you. Either one, you kill them all. And that's not what they were to do. B, you could send them into exile. That's probably not super effective because they're probably just going to go as far away as they can and then harbor a grudge for generations, like the Amalekites. The Amalekites still hate the Israelites all the way into the Persian period. I mean, that's the whole thing with Mordecai and Haman. He's an Amalekite. So there's going to be this grudge. Or you could actually not follow the law of Moses, not kill the military-aged men, let them go back to the other side of the river, and then what have you doomed your people to? Rape, pillage, murder next season. Now, if someone always says, well, you should imprison them. You don't have the money. You don't have the resources. I mean, how sick is it to expect the people who have been preyed upon to actually support, criminals? It's horrible. So what's your only option left? You can enslave them, and they're still alive.
And that would be the option that I would choose out of the ones you just gave. I would rather have that than some kind of life in prison.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because at least you have purpose. You've got an opportunity for growth. You've got an opportunity even to form a relationship with your master.
Yeah.
And then the whole other side is, right, God is also telling the Israelites, if they've gone about doing this, you're not going to treat your slave in the same way that the Babylonians treat their slaves or the Persians treat your slaves. So now there's some kind of moral, the moral law that's given applies to the slave, it applies to the master, right? So like the master now has to also live up to the 10 Commandments and these other laws with their slaves. So it actually is a more virtuous system than the other ones that you've said. That's a very helpful example.
Yeah, sure. And I've been using this for all 15 years of being a pastor, frankly. And it's hard. And it usually takes people that example to slow down and say, let me think about this. Because you don't always have the ideal. What the ideal would be is that every nation or family of people to flourish as Christian nations. That would be beautiful. That'd be wonderful. But bad stuff happens and you have to deal with this, and it's not ideal. And, it's hard for us to think about. And I do think part of it is coming from, in the broad sweep of history, a very affluent society and, putting prisoners far away and not having to deal with it up close and personal for much of our country. It's very difficult for people to wrestle with these things. And yet being someone rooted in history and tradition, like Lutherans should be, we should understand that C.F.W. Walther is right. The Bible talks a lot about how masters should treat their slaves and slaves should treat their masters far more than what system is the best. Why? Because Walther is humble. And Luther is humble when it comes to civil matters. He's very humble about it. He doesn't pretend like kind of classic Enlightenment thinking, this is the ideal society, this is how it should be for every place, every time, every people, but rather far more humble about saying, well, it's really going to depend on a lot of contextual, historical issues. And so what's the actual heart of the matter? Well, whether you're a Jew or a Greek, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're a slave or whether you're free, you need to be a good Christian. And there's going to be a lot of variance from society to society. That's not to say that there aren't ideals, but that's to say we have to be humble. And that is something that, generally speaking, Enlightenment thinkers were not. They weren't very humble. Let's evolve. Let's develop. Let's create utopias. I mean, they were utopianists.
And two thoughts here. One, you just gave what might have been the best examples because it's the most, maybe it's the most difficult domino probably to tackle there. But of what you were talking about earlier of if you start with the scriptures and, to your case, tradition as well, but even just the scriptures, to your point, the scriptures, this is how they speak about slavery, right? So if you want to come up with this maxim that like there should be zero slavery or anything in the whole world, does the Bible make that claim?
Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay. So, right. So if you start with the scriptures, that's the way you're going to go about it. And then the second point is just practically speaking, someone might be listening today and they might be in the suburbia, Minnesota, suburb of Minneapolis, like I am. And you might be like, well, we don't have slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, maybe not in your backyard. What about your iPhone? Are you ready to destroy your iPhone? Because the system that we have, it might look really beautiful when you're in suburban Minneapolis, but open up the Pandora's box of looking into many of the wars that we've been in the past, many of the wars that we support today. Yeah. I mean, the alternative that we might think looks so bright and beautiful now, the more you pull back the onions and look at what's going on, there's tons of travesties globally that we are even involved in. And the point is, like, you can't get rid of evil.
Yeah.
You have to manage the evil that's there. And the Bible, that's what the Bible teaches you to do, is to manage this. And you're going to have to do it in a broken world. Yeah. And if you think we've overcome that with this kind of enlightenment or whatnot, we haven't. And a lot of the gifts that we have as Western suburbanites are on the backs of other people. Yeah. And the more and more you look into it, the more you realize that the system is still very broken. We just happen to be the ones who are immune from it.
Well, and also, even more humble Enlightenment thinkers would say we need to keep moving towards a better system. And of course, I'm not denying that there aren't better or worse systems.
And you're not advocating for slavery in America, right?
Well, actually, there is slavery in America right now. And I don't mean slavery to the iPhone. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if you go back and read the amendment that outlaws slavery, there's an exception. And it's imprisonment. The essential definition of slavery is actually you don't have freedom of motion. I mean, I'm summarizing, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a serf. Why is a serf kind of like half of a slave or half in slavery? Because many serfs were tied to the land. They couldn't leave, So prisoners, by definition, are in the traditional definition of slavery, slaves. So I actually kind of like bringing that up to make people think about it. What is a slave? Yeah, there's a whole spectrum of slavery, but imprisonment is a form of slavery.